Uh, Hello guys, so welcome to Spring Framework questions. Let's learn about Spring Boot questions. So the first question is what is Spring Boot and how does it differ from Spring Framework? So Spring Boot is a framework designed to simplify the development of Spring-based applications. It builds upon Spring Framework. Okay, so Spring Boot build on top of Spring Framework, and it is designed to simplify the development of Spring-based applications, providing a convention over configuration approach and auto configuration capabilities. So, unlike the Spring Framework, which requires explicit configuration, Spring Boot aims to minimize boilerplate code and provide default for various components. This make it easier to get started with Spring-based framework. So, basically in Spring framework, we need to provide explicit configuration for everything. But in Spring Boot, it does it automatically. Many things are done automatically here. So it reduces boilerplate code. Okay, and it provide default for various components. Now the second question: explain the benefits of using Spring Boot for application development. So some benefits of using Spring Boot for application development include simplified setup and configuration through auto configuration and starter dependencies. Okay. The second thing is reduce boilerplate code and enabling developers to focus on one application logic. The third is embedded server support, allowing applications to be run in standalone jar files. The fourth one is enhanced testability through the provision of test utilities and annotations. Okay, so सबसे पहला इसमें क्या था? It is simplified setup. Okay, and the configuration to auto. So it auto configuration is there, and starter dependencies are there, and it reduces boilerplate load. Okay, and it enables developer to focus on more on application logic. Okay, it has embedded server support. So there are three servers that are already there. Okay, allowing applications to be run on as standalone jar files, and it has enhanced testability for testing. It has some support and provision of test utility and annotations. Simple. Now the third question is what is the key features of Spring Boot? Some key features Spring Boot include auto configuration. So what is auto configuration? It automatically configures Spring Boot application based on dependencies and defaults. Okay. The second thing is starter dependencies. So it's pre-packaged dependencies that simplify the setup of specific application features or technologies. Okay. The third is what is third? Third is developer tools. So tools that enhance developers' productivity, such as automatic application restarts and live reload. Okay. And actuator. So provide endpoints for monitoring and managing applications at runtime. The fourth question is explain the concept of Spring Boot starters and provide an example. So in the context of Spring Boot, starters are a set of convention dependency management providers. Okay, that one can include in a Spring Boot application. Starters are a collection of dependency descriptors which can help simplify your dependency management. For instance, if you want to get started with Spring JPA, you just have to include the Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency and everything required for it, like Hibernate, Spring Data, etc., will be added to your application. So, suppose if you want JPA, so we just need to include this dependency, Spring Boot starter data JPA, and all the things that require this dependency, like Hibernate dependency or Spring Data dependency. It will be added automatically to our application. Okay, so here is example of Spring Boot starter JPA. So we can add this in our uh, pom.xml file. So what is the purpose of at the rate Spring Boot application? So at the rate Spring Boot application annotation is a convenience annotation provided by Spring Boot. It serves as the entry point for the Spring Boot application. It combines the commonly used annotations like added configuration, added auto configuration, and added component scan. So all three annotations are added at the same time if you add at the rate Spring Boot application. What are those annotations? At the rate component scan, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate configuration. With Spring Boot, at the rate Spring Boot application, developers can enable auto configuration, component scanning, and configuration properties in single step. So here from one annotation we are getting, we are enabling auto configuration. Okay, from this annotation enable auto configuration, we are enabling auto configuration. From component scanning we can enable by this annotation, and configuration properties we can add by this annotation. So we can add all three things by this single annotation. What is default port number of Spring Boot application? The default port number for Spring Boot application is 8080. However, you can change it by specifying the desired port number in the application configuration file. For example, application.properties file using the properties server.port. Now, how can you enable auto configuration feature in Spring Boot? So auto configuration is enabled by default in Spring Boot. Okay, so it leverages the class path and the defined dependencies to automatically configure the application. Spring Boot analyzes the dependencies and uses their presence to configure various components such as data resources, web servers, and messaging systems. Okay, so how do you enable auto configuration? So the auto configuration is basically by default is enabled by in Spring Boot, and it leverages a class path and defined dependencies to automatically configure the application. तो Spring Boot क्या करता है? It leverages class path and जो भी आपने dependency define की है, whatever dependencies you have defined in your pom.xml, so it uses those dependencies to configure the application. And Spring Boot analyzes the dependencies and uses their presence to configure various components. So dependencies के हिसाब से it configures various components such as data sources. Okay, so data, so if you have defined like MySQL, so it will define use according, you make data sources according to that, right? you, the web servers or the messaging system, whatever you have defined dependencies, so it configure various components according to those dependencies. If needed, you can disable specific auto configuration classes. So you can also disable certain auto configuration classes if needed, and customize the configuration by providing your own beans. Explain the concept of starters in Spring Boot application. So starters in Spring Boot are set of dependencies. So what are starter in Spring Boot application? It is a set of dependencies that make it easier to configure and use specific features. Okay, a set of dependencies that make it easier to configure. Okay, and to use a specific feature or technologies in an application. They encapsulate the required dependencies and configurations. So basically, they can encapsulate the required dependency configuration, allowing developers to add them to their project with minimal effort. For example, Spring Boot Starter includes all the necessary dependencies for including web application, including the Spring MVC framework, embedded web server, and JSON support. So if you add Spring Boot started web, so it will install all the required dependencies that is used in web, like Spring MVC framework, embedded web server, and JSON support. Okay, so that is the use of starter dependencies. How does Spring Boot handle external configuration? The Spring Boot provides multiple ways to handle external configuration. It supports property files like application properties that can be placed in various locations, including class path, file system, or external directories. Okay. So Spring Boot also supports environment variables, so command line arrangements, and user profiles for different deployment environments. The configuration values can be accessed using at that value annotation. and or by binding them to Java object using the configuration properties annotation. Okay. What is the purpose of application properties? So the application properties or application.yml file is used for external configuration in a Spring Boot application. It allows developers to specify various properties and their values to configure the application. These properties can control various aspects of the application such as server port, database connection detail, logging configuration, okay, and much more. The properties file can be placed in the class path or other predefined locations. Spring Boot will automatically load and apply the configuration during application startup. So describe the Spring Boot auto configuration mechanism. The Spring Boot auto configuration mechanism automatically configures the Spring Boot application based on dependencies present in the class path. Okay, it uses the concept of conditionals to determine which bean and configuration should be enabled or disabled. Okay, so Spring Boot auto configure mechanism automatically configures the Spring Boot application based on dependencies present in class path, and it uses the concept of conditionals to determine which beans and configurations should be enabled or disabled. By analyzing the class path and the available configuration, Spring Boot can provide sensible defaults and reduce the needs of explicit configuration. This makes it easier to start and configure a Spring application. What is the purpose of at that component scan? At the rate component annotation, sorry. So the at the rate component annotation is a core annotation from the Spring framework and is also used in Spring Boot. So it is a generic stereotype annotation used to mark a class as a Spring managed component. So if you want to mark some class as a Spring managed component, you can use at the rate component annotation. Okay. The components are auto-directed by Spring and can be used for dependency injection. Okay, and component scanning. So at the rate component annotation serves as a base annotation for more specific annotations like at the rate repository, at the rate service, or at the rate controller. So at the rate component is a base annotation, but you can define some specific annotation like at the rate repository annotation or at the rate service annotation or at the rate controller annotation. So it will be auto detected by Spring and can be used for dependency injection and component scanning. Okay, now Now explain the difference between add-that component, add-that repository, add-that service, and add-that controller annotation in Spring Boot. So add-that component क्या होता है? It is a generic stereotype annotation. I used to mark a class as a Spring managed component. So if you if you want to mark some class as a Spring managed component, then you can use add-that component. And it is a broad and generic term that can be used for any type of Spring managed component. Okay, what is at the repository? So it is a specialized form of at the component and used to indicate that a class is a repository or data access component. It typically encapsulates database operations and exception translation. What is service? So it is a specialized form of at component used to indicate that a class is a service component. It encapsulates business logic. Okay, and it is often used as an intermediate layer between controller and repositories. So service layer is used as an intermediate layer between components and repositories, and it is a specialized form of attached component and it is used to indicate that a class is service component. What is controller? So it is a specialized form of attached component used to indicate that a class is a web controller component and it handles incoming requests and performs logic, business logic, and prepares the response to be sent back to the client. What is the role of at the rate autowired? So the added AutoWire annotation is used for dependency injection in Spring Boot. When applied to a field setter method or constructor, it allows Spring to automatically resolve and inject the required dependencies. By using added AutoWire, developers don't need to manually instantiate and wire dependencies. Spring Boot scans the application context for beans and matching the required type and inject them automatically. Okay. So if you use auto wired, then what happens? We don't need to manually instantiate and wire dependencies. So in that case, Spring Boot scans the application context, okay, for beans, and it matches the required type and ingests them automatically in the components. Okay. What how can you implement logging in a Spring Boot application? So in a Spring Boot application, logging is typically implemented using a logging framework such as Logback or Log4j2. Log4j2. So Spring Boot provides a default logging configuration out of the box. You can configure logging levels, appenders, and log formats using the application properties. Okay. Additionally, you can include a desired logging framework dependencies in your project, build configuration, okay, and use framework APIs to perform logging within your application. So we can define logging levels, we can define appenders, we can use log formats using the application properties. Additionally, we can include the desired logging framework dependencies in our project, build configuration, okay, and use the frameworks API to perform logging within our application code. So what is the purpose of Spring Boot Spring application dot run method? So the Spring application dot run method is used to bootstrap and launch a Spring application. It is typically invoked from the main method of the application entry point class. The run method initializes the Spring application context, performs auto configuration, starts the embedded server, and starts the application lifecycle. It returns an instance of the application context, allowing access to the application context and its beans. So what is Spring Boot CLI? So Spring Boot command line interface is a command line tool that you can use to run and test Spring Boot applications from a command line prompt. It provides a fast way to get Spring Boot applications up and running. The CLI incorporates Spring scripts into Unix-based shell to launch the Spring Boot application. Okay, so you can use command line Spring command line interface, okay, to run and test Spring Boot application from a command prompt, and it provide a fast way to get Spring application up and running. So the command line interface incorporates Spring script into Unix-based shell to launch the Spring Boot applications. Some of the advantage of Spring Boot CLI: it allows you to write your application using Groovy, okay, which is more sufficient and expressive alternative to Java. It automatically includes useful external libraries whenever possible. For example, if you are writing a web application and importing classes such as REST controller, the CLI will automatically provide a dependency for Spring MSC. So if you are writing web application and importing classes such as REST controller, the CLI will automatically provide a dependency for Spring MVC. You can use various commands for different operations like run to run the application, test to test the application, jar to create jar, init to create a basic Java Groovy project, etc. How does Spring Boot handle data validation? So in a Spring Boot, data validation can be performed using various mechanisms. One common approach is to use validation annotation provided by Bean Validation API, such as not null, size, and pattern on the fields of model objects. Okay. So by including necessary validation annotation, Spring Boot automatically validates the input data and generate validation errors. These errors can be handled using binding result or error objects. Additionally, custom validation logic can be implemented by creating custom validation classes and methods. What is the purpose of request mapping annotation in Spring Boot? So the request mapping annotation is used to map HTTP request to a specific handler method in Spring Boot application. It is applied to at the method or class level to define the URL patterns that should trigger the execution of annotated method. So what happens with request mapping annotation? So it used to my HTTP request today to a handler in a Spring Boot application. It applies at the method or class level to define the URL pattern that should trigger the execution of the annotation method. So request mapping allows developers to specify various attributes such as HTTP, method, get, post, etc., request parameters, headers, and more to further refine mapping. Okay. How does Spring Boot integrate with containerization platforms like Docker and Kubernetes? So Spring Boot integrates seamlessly with containerization platforms like Docker or Kubernetes. You can package a Spring Boot application as a Docker image by creating a Docker file that includes necessary dependencies and configuration. The image can be built deployed to a containerization platform like Docker, Swarm, or Kubernetes. Spring Boot also provides features like externalized configuration and health indicators, which can be leveraged by container orchestration platforms for efficient management and scaling the application. Okay, so what is Docker and Kubernetes? So Spring Boot integrates seamlessly with containerization platform. So it integrates seamlessly with Docker and Kubernetes. So you can package a Spring Boot application as a Docker image by creating a Docker file that includes the necessary dependency and configuration. The image can be built and deployed to a platform containerization platform like Docker Swarm or Kubernetes. And Spring Boot also provides features like externalized configuration and health indicator that can be leveraged by container platforms for efficient management and scaling of application. So explain the concept of message-driven microservices using in the Spring Boot and Apache Pulsar. Message-driven microservices using Spring Boot and Apache Pulsar leverage the publish-subscribe messaging pattern to enable loosely coupled and scalable communication between microservices. Apache Pulsar acts as a messaging system and Spring Boot provides the necessary abstraction for consuming and producing messages. With Pulsar messaging features Spring Boot integration, you can implement event-driven architecture where microservices communicate asynchronously through messages. They ensure decoupling of fault tolerance. So message-driven microservice using Spring Boot Apache will leverage the publish-subscribe messaging pattern. Okay, to enable loosely coupled and scalable accommodation using microservices. So Apache Pulsar acts as the messaging system and Spring Boot provides a necessary abstraction for consuming and producing message. With Apache with Pulsar messaging features and Spring Boot integration, you can implement event-driven architecture where microservices can communicate asynchronously. Okay, event-driven architecture where microservices can communicate asynchronously through messages. This ensure decoupling and fault tolerance. What is the purpose of add the rate value annotation in Spring Boot? So the add the rate value annotation is used to inject values from properties file, environment file, or other sources in the Spring managed beans. It can be applied to fields, method, or constructor parameters. With add the rate value, developers can easily access and use configuration properties or other values within the application code. The values can be specified directly or referenced using Spring expression language expressions. Okay, so with at the rate value, developer can easily access and use configuration properties or other values within application code. So at the values can be specified directly or using Spring expression language, and at the rate value annotation is used to inject values from property files, environment variable, other sources into Spring managed beans. It can be applied to field methods or constructor parameters. Describe the role of command line runner and application runner interfaces in Spring Boot. So in Spring Boot, the command line runner and application runner interface are used for performing specific tasks during the application starter process. When implemented, these interfaces provide a fallback method run that execute once the application context is initialized. So they are particularly useful for performing tasks like data initialization, okay, and cache population or other one-time setup operations. A main difference between them is that command line runner receives the application's command line arguments as a parameter, and application runner receives the application argument object. So these two interfaces basically perform a specific task during the Spring application startup process, and when implemented, this interface provides a callback method, that is run method, that gets executed once the application context is initialized. So they are particularly useful for performing tasks such as data initialization, cache population, and other one-time setup operations. Main difference between them is the command line runner receives the application command line argument as parameter, and runner receive application argument object. Okay. So how can you implement pagination in a Spring Boot application? To implement pagination in a Spring Boot application, you can utilize features provided by libraries like Spring Data JPA. Okay, so implement pagination in a Spring Boot application, you can utilize features provided by libraries such as Spring Data JPA or Spring Data MongoDB. They offer built-in support for pagination through the use of pageable objects and pository methods. You can receive a subset of data from a larger dataset by specifying the page number, page size, and sort criteria. The result is typically returned as a page object that contains the requested data along with metadata such as total element, total pages, and more. Okay. Explain the concept of bean scopes in Spring Boot. So bean scopes define the life cycle and visibility of Spring managed beans in a Spring Boot application. So they provide the following are commonly used bean scopes. Okay, singleton. So only one instance of the bean is created and shared across entire application context. Prototype. A new instance of bean is created each time it is requested. Request. A new instance of beans is created for each HTTP request, and it only applicable in web application context. Session. A new instance of bean is created for each user session, and it is only applicable in a web application context. Custom scope. So Spring Boot allows defining bean scope by implementing the scope interface and registering them in application context. So what is the purpose of added qualifier application in Spring Boot? So the added qualifier annotation Spring Boot is used to disambiguate between bean references. When we have multiple beans of the same type defined in Spring container, it is used in scenarios where a given type has a more than one implementation. So we need to inject a specific implementation. So by default, Spring uses the by type auto-wiring mechanism. This means that if we have more than one bean of the same type, so then Spring Boot will throw no unique bean definition as exception because it won't know which one to auto-wire. Okay. So the at the rate qualifier integration can be used in conjunction with auto-wired to specify which exact bean should be wired by providing a name of the bean as the qualifier value. How does Spring Boot handle exception logging and error handling? So in Spring Boot, exception logging and error handling can be configured using various mechanisms. So Spring Boot automatically provide a default error page that displays a standardized error message for unhandled exceptions. Okay, so in Spring Boot, exception logging and error handling can be configured using various mechanisms. Spring Boot automatically provides a default error page that displays a standard error message for unhandled exceptions. However, you can customize the error handling and behavior by implementing exception handlers using the At the rate controller advice as annotation, and handling specific exception in dedicated methods. Additionally, you can configure logging framework to capture and log exception with desired level of detail and appenders. Okay, so you can customize error handling behavior by implementing exception handler using the at the rate controller advice annotation. Describe the purpose and usage of at the rate controller advice annotation. The at the rate rest controller advice annotation is a specialized form of at the rate controller advice annotation in Spring Boot. It combines the functionality of at the rate controller advice and response body, making it convenient for implementing global exception handling in RESTful APIs. By using address controller advice, you can define exception handler that handle expression thrown by address request mapping or address REST controller within application. And the exception handlers can return error responses in JSON or other supported formats. So let's repeat this. So at the rate controller advice annotation is a annotation. It's a specialized form of at the rate controller advice, and it combines functionality of at the rate controller advice and response body. Basically, it this is the combination of both annotation at the rate controller advice and at the rate response body, and it is basically used for implementing global expression handling in RESTful APIs. Okay, so by using controller advice, you can define exception handler that handle exception thrown by request mapping or REST controller, you know, and it can return error responses in JSON format. So what is the purpose of address controller address configuration properties annotation in Spring Boot? So address configuration properties annotation is used to bind external configuration properties to Spring managed beans. Okay. So by annotating a bean class with address configuration properties and specifying a prefix, you can map properties with matching names to fields of setter and method setter or setter method of the bean. So Spring Boot will automatically bind the values from the configuration sources to the corresponding bean properties, and the annotation simplifies the retrieval and usage of configuration properties within your application. So basically, the at the rate configuration properties annotation is used to bind external configuration properties to Spring managed beans. Okay, so you have defined external configuration property somewhere, and you want to bind it to our Spring managed beans. Then we will use added configuration properties. So by integrating a bean class with added configuration properties and specifying a prefix, you can map properties with matching names to the fields or setter method of the bean. So Spring Boot will automatically bind the values from the configuration sources to the corresponding bean properties. So the annotation simplifies the retrieval and usage of configuration properties with our application. So describe the purpose and usage of at-the-rate dynamic property source annotation in Spring Boot testing. So at-the-rate proper dynamic property source annotation in Spring Boot testing allows you to dynamically define and modify configuration properties during the test execution. Okay, so you can use this annotation in conjunction with test property values class to set or override properties based on dynamic values or test condition. So basically, the dynamic properties annotation in Spring Boot testing allows you to dynamically define and modify configuration properties during the test execution. And you can use this annotation in conjunction with test property values class to set or override properties based on dynamic value or test condition. So this provides flexibility in configuring the environment for testing and allows you to simulate different scenarios of configuration during testing. So what is the purpose of added transactional event listener annotation in Spring Boot? So at the rate transactional event listener annotation in Spring Boot lets you to listen to transactional events and perform action based on those events. So you can use this annotation or methods that should be invoked when a specific transactional event occurs, such as before or after a transaction is committed or rollback. So the transactional event listener annotation provides a convenient way to handle domain specific logic or side effect based on transaction event in Spring Boot application. Okay. What is the purpose of address scheduled annotation in Spring Boot? The address schedule annotation is used to configure scheduled tasks in Spring Boot application. Applying this annotation to a method enables you to specify the schedule at which method should be executed. The schedule can be defined using various options such as fixed rate, fixed delay, or cron expression. Spring Boot automatically returns and executes the schedule method based on specified schedule. Describe the role of profile annotation. So the address profile annotation is used to activate or deactivate specific configuration components or beans based on current environment profile or profile in Spring Boot application. And creating a class or method with address profile, the specifying desired profile name lets you control when that component of bean should be active. This allows you to have different configurations for different development environments such as development, testing, or production. Okay. What is the purpose of Spring Boot dynamic reloading and how it works? So Spring Boot's dynamic reloading feature allows you to make changes to the application code or resources without the need to restart the entire application. It improves development productivity by automatically reloading the modified classes or resources on the fly. So dynamic reloading allows you to make changes to application resources without need to restart the application. So it improves the productivity or automatically reloading the modified classes or resources on the fly. The dynamic reloading feature uses class loading and mechanisms provided by underlying JVM such as Java Instrumentation API or custom class loaders to load the changed classes while preserving the application state. Explain the concept of externalized logging in Spring Boot using Logback and Log4j2. So externalized logging in Spring Boot allows you to configure and customize logging behavior without modifying the application code. So Logback or Log4j2 can be used as the underlying logging framework. The configuration is typically done in an external configuration file such as logback.xml or log4j2.xml, which can be placed in the class file specified using the logging.config property. The externalized logging configuration file provides flexibility in defining log levels, appenders, formatters, and other logging related properties. External login allows you to configure and customize logging behavior without modifying application code. So Log4j can be used for underlying logging framework. The configuration is typically done in external configuration file in an XML file, which can be placed in the class path or specified using logging.config property. The externalized logging configuration file provides flexibility in defining log levels, appenders, format, and other logging related properties. What is the purpose of added model attribute in Spring Boot application? So added model attribute annotation is used in Spring Boot to bind request parameters of form data to method parameters or model attributes. It can be applied to method parameters or method return values. When applied to method parameters, the model parameter binds the incoming request parameter form data to the corresponding method parameters. When applied to method return values, it binds the method return values to a method attribute, making it available in the view for rendering. Okay, so when applied to method parameter, annotation binds the incoming request parameters or form data, okay, to the corresponding method parameters. When applied to return value, it binds the method's return value to a model attribute, making it available in the view for rendering. So the model attribute annotation in Spring Boot is used to bind request parameters or form data to a method parameters or method attributes. It can be applied to method parameters or method return values. Okay. Explain the concept of reactive messaging. Explain the concept of reactive messaging with Spring Boot and Apache Kafka streams. So, reactive messaging with Spring Boot and Apache Kafka Stream enables the building of real-time streaming application that react to events and reactively process data streams. So Spring Cloud String provide abstractions to integrate Spring Boot applications with Kafka streams. So with stream listener annotations, you can consume Kafka topics at reactive streams and perform processing operations using the reactive programming model. This approach facilitates the development of scalable and resilient streaming applications. Okay, so reactive messaging with Spring Boot Apache Kafka enables building of real-time streaming applications that react to events and reactively process data streams. And Spring Cloud Stream provide abstractions to integrate Spring Boot application with Kafka Stream. So with added stream listener annotation, you can consume Kafka topics as reactive stream and perform processing operations using the reactive programming model. And this approach facilitates the development of scalable and resilient streaming applications. Okay. Describe the purpose and usage of address transaction propagation and transaction propagation dot nested annotation.